The title of this meeting is The Next Labour Leader. So obviously what you're expecting me to do is to devote the next hour or so to dividing up the time between the three contestants, putting the case for and against each of the three contestants for the Labour leadership and coming up with a conclusion. I said that's what you're wanting me to do. There's been not much else except that on most of the media, and especially in view of what we just heard, I rather think I won't be doing that. Because we all, I think, know that the leadership is going to be won by Tony Blair. Now, there's a strange thing about the Blair campaign, very curious thing. But if you go out in the country and talk to people who are Labour Party members and who have votes and who care about these things, and there are lots and lots of them, you'll find almost unanimously a tremendous hatred for Blair. Have you discovered that? I'm a reasonable sort of person. I'm quite shocked by the sort of things that people say about Blair. You know, they say he's the man who instructed the shadow cabinet that they won't give any pledge on privatisation. Perfectly true he is. Said on no account are we to say that anything, not water, not electricity, not telephones, not even the post office, this is his latest instruction, are we to say that Labour are going to take back. They are still committed on the railways, but if Blair gets in, I wouldn't give that commitment much chance. So he's the chap who's in favour of privatisation. He's the chap who is very, very keen not to give any undertaking at all on the trade union legislation, isn't he? He's the one who says, we're not going to say we're going to repeal anything. Not going to say we're not going to repeal anything, but then we're not going to say that we are going to repeal anything. So as far as we know, he's the one that says the Tory laws on trade unions stand. We have no commitment on that whatsoever. He's the one, and this I think is the thing which gets people angriest of all. He's the one who's given the instruction that there was to be no opposition in Parliament or outside to the Criminal Justice Bill. The second reading of the Criminal Justice Bill, and you need to get this into your heads because it's going to be a big issue over the next few weeks. The second reading of the Criminal Justice Bill in the House of Commons passed without opposition from Her Majesty's opposition. Not even was the House divided by the campaign group or any section of the Labour Party in Parliament. The second reading, the third reading's to come. We'll have to see what they're doing about that. Now when people say to Blair, you're on the right to silence, what's your position on the right to silence? What's your position on the travellers? What's your position on the raves? And all the rest of the reactionary legislation which is laid out there. Every single little enemy that the Tories have, even the Hunt saboteurs. I mean, I always understood, I'm not an expert on this, but I always understood that it was the Hunt saboteurs that got beaten over the head by the Hunt's people. Wasn't that right? They got beaten. Well, the legislation says the other way round. It's the Hunt saboteurs coming with their sticks and their horses, coming to attack the Hunt's people who are going around on foot in jeans and the same way the miners' strike. And we've got to defend the poor Hunt people, who after all are friendly with Michael Howard, from these terrible attacks. It's Blair who insisted they shouldn't vote against the Criminal Justice Bill in the House of Commons, and he's still insisting, as far as I know, that they shouldn't vote against it. And so there's a rage about his attitude to the policies, and there's a rage about his attitude to the struggles. It's he who issued the instruction that not a single one of them, not Cook, not Dobson, not one of them could come out in support of the single workers' strike. An official strike, balloted for strike, a union that's been associated with the Labour Party since it was first formed in 1900, going all the way back all those years. Here's John Prescott on the television, a member of that union. Say, yes, it's my union, yes, they've got an open hiring case, you support the strike. I don't know what to say about that. Perhaps you'll ask me another question, or perhaps I'll answer another question if you don't ask me one, and those instructions come from Blair. That's where those instructions come from. And there's a great rage about him, right the way through the whole Labour movement. But here's the riddle. Here's the conundrum. The same people, I don't know if you've had that experience, the same people who say, I detest him! He represents everything I detest about the modern Labour Party, say they're going to vote for him. Well, I can think of 5 or 6 people I've spoken to in the last 6 weeks, who quite good left-wing people in the Labour Party, who said that. We hate him, and we're going to vote for him. He represents everything we detest, and he gets my vote. So you say to yourself, this is mad. Is everybody mad? Is everybody completely mad? No, we have to try and find the Marxists. We have to try and find solutions to these strange developments that take place inside the Labour movement. So what is the solution to this strange development? I'll give you a clue. I don't know where you were, something you remember where you were when you were told that John Smith had died. I was actually just going into the Scott Inquiry report. Victoria Street, somebody says John Smith had died. I don't know how this accords with your feeling, but my reaction was one of no interest at all. I knew John Smith. I knew him in Scotland when I first became a socialist all those years ago. John Smith was a right-wing member of the Labour Party, and I was a left-wing member of the Labour Party. So I knew him quite well. He used to fiddle the Union balance up there. Decent chap. As decent a chap as ever fiddled the Union balance. A very jolly chap and very nice fellow and all that kind of thing. I met him only recently in very convivial surroundings. And but as far as politics went, of course, I had not much sympathy with him. Indeed, I've been going up and down the country denouncing him rather unfairly on reflection as a fat Edinburgh lawyer, because, you know, it's not his fault that he's fat, and there's not all that much wrong with Edinburgh, and even the fact that he's a lawyer can't really be held against him. However, I had been denouncing him and therefore didn't feel any particular sorrow about it. However, going to work, going to meetings, speaking to people in the Labour movement about John Smith, and I'm sure you all have this experience, or most of you did, if you were silly enough or insensitive enough to make a joke such as the one which has just made all of you laugh, that you didn't really care one way or the other whether John Smith was alive or dead, were you to make such a statement in a workplace, then you would have been greeted with some disfavour. There would have been some pleasantness about it, wouldn't there? And people would have said, here, we don't agree with that, because there was a profound sense of loss in the Labour movement when he died. It developed almost into a sense of grief, which seemed to take over. Large numbers of very, very decent people who cared about what was happening in the country, they seemed to be really sorry, really upset about what had happened. And again, how can that be? He was a distant figure, Smith. He was remote. He was very, 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 very right-wing indeed. How is it that so many socialists, people who regard themselves as socialists, felt this sense of loss? I think perhaps the answer to that helps us a little bit in understanding the conundrum about the next Labour leader. Because why people felt so depressed about John Smith was not his oratory. He wasn't an orator, he wasn't the man of the people, all that stuff that Donald Dewar said dispute, all that, all a lot of baloney. Neither Donald Dewar nor John Smith are men of the people in any sense. They're perfectly decent people, they're not men of the people in any sense whatsoever. All that absolute baloney. The reason why people felt so depressed about John Smith, sad about John Smith, is the same reason that the people who hate Blair are going to vote for him, and that is because they saw both as people who are likely to lead the Labour Party to victory at the next election. That with John Smith's death went the chance of getting these Tories out, and the replacement for John Smith must be someone who can get the Tories out. And they believed the enormous great weight of propaganda. Don't forget that Blair was discovered by the Tory press. He was promoted by the Tory press. He's the one that the Tories fear. Do you remember that? In the Daily Mail. Blair, the man the Tories fear. A little bit of a rhyme there. A little bit of a poetry coming out from the Daily Mail leader writer, Roger Rosewood or someone of that kind, saying, yes, yes. Blair's the one the Tories are quaking in their boots in case Blair is elected. Watch out, don't vote Blair in because we're all terrified of him. Why are they terrified of him? He's absolutely promised them he's not going to take a penny off them. Not a bit of their property is he going to remove. So why are they terrified? Nevertheless, the propaganda starts in the Tory media. Blair's the one who can win, and precisely because people believe that propaganda, they say, we're going to vote for the man we hate. We're going to swing along, not just vote for him, but swing along with all the awful things he's going to do in the next few months because he's going to be the one and he's the best chance by far of beating the Tories. So, what I want to test is this. I want to test this strategy that says the way to beat the Tories is the Blair way. That's the way to get the Tories out. Let's just test it. It's not just a statement or propaganda, but let's test it in terms of the facts, the political facts. And since we've had a wonderful meeting this week about genes and science and so on, I thought we'd try it with a little scientific testing, or what I call the Kinnock experiment. Now, not since Dr. Frankenstein applied his mind to how he could create a human being has there ever been a transformation of a single human being perpetrated by the political geneticists of our society today as there was on poor old Neil Kinnock. I remember when Neil Kinnock came to Parliament in 1970 down here, a young man in his 20s. He was full of life, energy, militancy. He made a tremendous speech about how he liked hitting scabs on the strikes and the miners' strike of 1972, how he wasn't going to put up with that, his fist was up there on the picket line. He was full of fun, full of confidence in his socialistic attitudes, and most particularly, he was a campaigner against nuclear weapons. All these things I can remember, could see him there. Now they took this rough young man, they took him and put him into this experiment. They shoved him into suits. They honed his fingernails. They scrubbed what was remaining of his hair. They took every part of him and manufactured him into something which was completely different to what he actually was. They must have interfered with his genes, because this man who had been an ardent peace campaigner was suddenly an ardent arms campaigner. I'm for British arms. There's a difference between these two statements. I'm against British nuclear weapons. I'm for British nuclear weapons. Have you noticed the difference? And then suddenly he's moved, he's shifted. He's not this jolly confident, he's awkward, he's fiddling with his cuffs, he's trailing behind royalty, he's grovelling to the establishment, he's acting like a man in a balloon with Labour policies which he's throwing out of the balloon in order to hope that the balloon will rise. Nationalisation, out of the window. Are we going to take back any private? Out of the window. Commitment to full employment, Gordon says, chuck it out. Gordon Blair, good chap, Gordon Blair, let's chuck it out. Commitment to full employment. And here's this man, desperate, lugubrious, terribly depressed, losing all his energy and verve, and what's the argument? The argument is that such a person would win us the election. People went along with it. Sylvia Heald won the Mid-Staffs by-election in 1990 with the biggest swing ever for the Labour Party in the history of by-elections in this country. Tremendous victory for her. She went down to the Labour Party conference that year, that very same year, 1990, and she said, I used to be chair of my CND, my local CND, on the National Committee of CND. I'm prepared to sacrifice CND, I'm prepared to support British nuclear weapons in exchange for winning the next election with Neil Kinnock. Profound and prolonged applause from the Labour Party conference. Lots and lots of people thought the same. Oh yes, awkward, and pity about all those campaigning for peace, but out the window with it. We'll get rid of it in order that we can win the election. They got it all in place. They ditched the CMD, they ditched the nationalisation, they ditched the privatisation, they even got the PR right this time. Do you remember that ridiculous rally in Sheffield where they all came with John Bradley? These new hot figures who are really just no more than dull, tedious career politicians appearing on the stage as if they were something magnificent. The razzmatazz, John Cole, you remember, which was the most magnificent rally I've ever seen in all my life, and it's going to change the whole pattern of politics in this country, and it's certain to lead to a Labour victory next week. All these things were happening. Policies were shifting. Policies being replaced by public relations, and a right-wing utterly respectable figure being put forward as the next Prime Minister. Well, April the 9th, 1992, the result of the experiment. There's the experiment and the result of the experiment. Not one of us can forget waking up, even the most revolutionary of us, the most unparliamentary of us, the people who care least about elections, can't forget waking up on April the 10th with the awful news that the bloody Tories under John Major, for heaven's sake, John Major, had won an election. I mean, even if they had no, man of absolutely no ability or panache whatsoever, had led his campaign, led his party to victory against the new model Labour Party. That's the result of that experiment. What's the conclusion from the experiment? The conclusion is that we must chuck more out of the balloon. The conclusion is that instead of finding someone who was left-wing and militant in their youth and moulding them into somebody who was suitably right-wing, we need the real article. We need someone who was born right-wing. Someone who was right-wing out of their cradle, who never said anything in the whole of his life which he had challenged anybody in any particular time. Who went through university without noticing there was a Labour club, who went through the whole of his time without understanding anything about class or anything to do with anything. We want the real figure. And they find him, have found the chap, haven't they? They find out it's incredible that such a person exists in the high echelons of the Labour Party. I mean, to get to the high echelons of the Labour Party without a single commitment during the whole of your life to working class people, dispossessed, socialist policies is an incredible phenomenon, an astonishing achievement. And Tony Blair done it, hasn't he? Wonderful. Tony Blair, MP, what is it they have in private eye? The anagram of Tony Blair MP is I'm Tory Plan B. You have to find somebody who, you have to find someone. The important thing about him is that Kinnock sometimes made mistakes. He got caught up. He sometimes got caught up in his own rhetoric, Kinnock, and said things he shouldn't have said. Now, it's very important, isn't it? It's very important that from now on the Labour leader says nothing. Because that was the problem. The problem was that he was too left-wing, Kinnock. So now we've got somebody who's no danger of being left-wing, but we must make sure that he says nothing. He says nothing. In today's Guardian, I read this: the sayings of Tony Blair. In place of the old debates between public or private sector, market or state, regulation or deregulation, we need to construct a new agenda. Rebuilding our National Health Service on the basis of need, not ability to pay, is an objective we cannot achieve, cannot fulfill, unless we act together. That's the sort of thing which, when you reflect upon it, achieve it, unless we act together. Us and perhaps the chairman of RTI. If you come in and act together, then maybe you can do something about it. I got the Transport General Workers Union paper, the record, which has the three candidates there today. I defy anyone to find the word socialist in any. But in the election addresses, the only one to mention socialist is Tony Blair. He says, see, this reminds me of Wilson at his best, actually, saying nothing. Yet we cannot stay still. Now, do you find people around the place saying... The answer is, the political answer to our problem is to stay still. Do you find anybody who said that? We are the stay still faction. We cannot stay still. The world is changing. That's brilliant. Bringing new opportunities and also fresh challenges in technology, in telecommunications, in the economic base of Southeast Asia. Is that a problem you find with people? Economic basin, is that a... Actually, what is an economic basin? Basin, I know what economic means, I know what basin means. Put the two words together, do they mean anything at all? Absolutely nothing, and therefore there's the man, isn't he? Somebody who says nothing. Silence will win the election. No policies, and no promises, and the famous advice of Roy Hattersley, which is this: we mustn't make promises in case we break them. I think really 100 years of British social democracy have led up to that brilliant idea. We've broken so many promises over the years that the answer is not to make any, and to speak into office without ever putting a policy in front of us. Now, I just want to test it. What's the evidence? What's the evidence that this reactionary silence wins elections? Is it true that Labour have won elections in 3 years in most of our living memory, or most of our adult living memory? 1964, 1966, and 1974 twice. Four elections they won in those 3 years. Was it the case that in those years the policies which are put forward in the manifesto of the Labour Party were tremendously right-wing? Is that compared with what we're used to now? I mean, I'm using language which is comparative. Is it the case? I mean, give you an example. In 1964, Harold Wilson's policy was that we could do away with the independent deterrent, because it was neither independent nor a deterrent. He said that over and over again in the election, got abused for it. 2 years before the 1964 election, the Labour Party in Parliament had opposed the Commonwealth Immigrants Act, which controlled all black people, all people from the Commonwealth, black people coming into this country. Before the Commonwealth, if the Commonwealth Immigrants Act had been defeated, according to Labour Party policy, then it would be open for 600 million black people, mostly black people, to come freely into this country. That was their policy in 62. Now, they altered it a little bit from the manifesto, but basically they were still for free movement of labour inside the Commonwealth. That was their position in 1964. I remember Harold Wilson going around London, places in London, and being heckled, "Hey, what about the blacks then?" He said, "What do you mean? Do you mean the nurses in the hospitals? Do you mean the people who are running our buses?" And he took them on the offensive, went back to them, and got great rounds of applause. So the policies, if you just look and compare the policies, I'm not going to go through it in any great detail, 64, 66, 74, particularly 74 as a matter of fact, when they went into the election with a more left-wing programme than ever before or since Labour's programme of 1973, tremendously left-wing programme. In these times they won the elections then, and their policy was miles to the left of the policies which they put forward in 83, 87 and 92. Now, I don't conclude, by the way, from that, I don't conclude that it follows if you have left-wing policy to get elected. Because what we do, we Marxists, what we do, is we look not just to this miserable little world of psephology, which infects so many people who talks about politics nowadays, this nonsense about psephology. We look to the reality of what's going on in the society. And the question we ask, I always ask, is what's happening in the world outside? And the main question about what's happening in the world outside is what's happening in the struggle between the dispossessed and the possessed, between the people who do the work and the people who are parasitical on the people who do the work. What's happening in that struggle? And the fact of the matter is, far better guide to what will happen in the election than what the policies are is what's the state of that struggle. In 1964, solid trade union movement, very low unemployment, confident and aggressive trade unions. 1964, 1966, winning battles. 1974, coming after the great miners' strikes, dockers' strikes of 72, the smashing of the incomes policies, the smashing of the Housing Finance Act, all those things. These were happening in the class outside. The result of that, and in fact, the elections. In fact, so, if you were to ask the question, does it follow automatically that a right-wing leader who says nothing, who does not encourage people to take any action, who will rejoice if these people are sent to prison tomorrow, on Tuesday when they're coming up, does it follow that such a person will win an election? The answer is, on every conceivable objective test, no, it doesn't follow. But I'll take it further than that, and I'll say, suppose they do get re-elected, because it's the relationship between the class struggle and elections is a complex and difficult relationship. Elections are so passive that people can sometimes vote against how they feel. They can hate Major so much that they'll even vote despite their lack of confidence, which is the main reason why they vote Tory. Lack of confidence, lack of ability in themselves, any idea of change. They may. The thing is complicated. There's one election, 1929, this century, where in spite of the class being defeated, they still voted Labour. So that may happen again. I'm not a predictor or a pseudologist. I'm saying that test doesn't, all the history shows the opposite. But suppose they win. Suppose they win, what happens then? And then we have the history, which informs us over 100 years now of social democracy. Then we have the history of what Labour did in 64 and 74. And since I mentioned the independent deterrent and immigration controls in 64, let's remember what they did, not what they said. They said we were against the independent deterrent. Within weeks they were groveling for the Polaris in the cabinet. Tony Greenwood, who had been chairman of CND, proposed that they keep Polaris within weeks of getting back to office when things were strong, when our side was strong. They were grovelling for the Polaris. In July 1965, they introduced the most disgusting immigration controls, which are the forerunner of all the immigration controls which followed, including the most grotesque of all, the Kenyan Asian Act of 1968, a Labour government Callahan legislation. These are things that we remember. These are things that made us into revolutionary socialists in the 60s, watching them as they're chucking out all the promises, even the miserable promises which they've made. So there's no proof that they'll win by the strategy which I've outlined, the Blair strategy, and certainly there isn't any proof that they will do anything if they win unless there's strength outside. What determines what they do when they get in is the same strength outside. Is the Labour movement strong outside? Are they taking on the employers? If they are, then the Labour government will shift to the left. If they're not, then the Labour government will shift to the right. And the Labour government will do its best to try and bring the trade unions into line so that they don't move. And I remember, for instance, things like in 64, when they first came in, within a day they passed a bill for the prevention of eviction. I remember in 74 when they came in, and don't forget this side of it as well, this side of the equation, within a few days they repealed the entire Industrial Relations Act. All the Tory laws have gone out the window, and the Tories didn't even dare vote for their own legislation when the minority Labour government abolished the industrial. So why was that? Why was that? Because of the strength outside. The miners were still on strike when Labour were elected in 1974. The miners were on strike, the country was the solution of the dispute was central to everything that happened, and therefore they repealed the whole of the Industrial Relations legislation. Now, the question therefore is, how long will they last? I remember Tony Blair, time of the miners' strike, we did a meeting somewhere up in Wembley, and we were going back to him, but lift back to his own. He said, how long do you think Kenneth would last if he got elected? It was in the middle of the miners' strike. So what do you mean last? He said, well, I'd say on an average, and this is a chap, by the way, who was involved in it, but it doesn't matter, all sinners that repented and so on. He says, well, the first Wilson government, I'll say, lasted until October 1967, the devaluation, when they smashed up the National Health Service and removed and imposed the prescription charges. He says that, I'll give it to him. The 1974 Labour government lasted 18 months until the social contract of 1975 or whatever it was. He worked it out. He says, I reckon that Kinnock will last 6 weeks. Okay, I say, okay, I'll give you 6 weeks for Kinnock and 6 hours for Blair. In fact, Blair won't last at all, because he'll be in there supporting the very things that he's meant to be lasting out against before he even gets into office. So, you know, either way, if it isn't true that they're going to win that way, they're going to beat the Tories out with Blair, and what's certainly true, beyond any shadow of doubt, is that Blair's not going to move an inch unless people move outside first. So, is it hopeless? I just repeat a few simple arguments, very, very simple. I haven't got a lot of time, but just a few very simple arguments which explains the situation. We live in a society whose central characteristic is that it is divided by class. That the wealth and power are owned because the wealth is owned and the means of production are owned by a tiny minority. These are simplicities, elementary things. It's terribly important to understand why these things happen. That wealth is controlled undemocratically. That the undemocratic control of wealth from the top of society runs all the time counter to anything democratic that goes on in the society, even Parliament. It runs against it. Your elections, any kind of elections, or any seeking of the views and opinions of the people down below who do the work, runs counter to the way in which the people who own the wealth want to run it. Sometimes they use the parliamentary system for their own purposes, but nevertheless it runs against it. And all the cards are stacked in this permanent battle about democracy on the side of the rulers. One person, one vote. I mean, is that a democratic system? If one person owns £5 million, 300,000 shares, 5 factories, 6 newspapers, and one person is unemployed, can't get a job in any of those places, are they equally represented in society? Does that make it equal representation? No, it makes it the opposite of equal representation. Elections are periodic. They don't go with the class struggle. They go up and down. The elections are fixed, so they fit the time when we go down, they go up. Elections are geographic. That is, people are elected on the basis of where they live, which has nothing to do with their real role in society, which is what class they come from, where they work, and so on. Elections to Parliament are geographic. Most of all, the state which runs the system, in spite of Parliament, which runs the system, Parliament operating as a talking shop, and then the state which actually carries out the work, the whole state is unelected. The whole state is part and parcel of the wealth of the people at the top of society. Now, the state, I mean the civil service that carries out those laws, the army and police that put them into effect, the judges that run their laws, the media barons, all the rest of these people who are unelected. These are the people who really run society. And there is no contest. There is no contest between them and the people who run and the Parliament, the democracy of Parliament. There's no contest. We've seen in the last few weeks just how grotesquely the ruling class has got more and more of their claws into the Parliament. Now they buy their MPs. MPs for sale. Don't we find now? How much is the question? £1,000. You see, if you're a member for Morgan Grenfell, you see, when I say, who is this man? He's a member for Morgan Grenfell. He also comes to Parliament because he represents, I don't know, Aylesbury or somewhere like that. But he really represents Morgan Grenfell. Why do I say that? Is that a rude and unpleasant thing to say? I hope so. But let's say, is it a rude and unpleasant thing to say about a Tory? No, it's not just rude and unpleasant. It's true, because Morgan Grenfell paid that man twice, 3 times as much as he gets from the people for representing them. And so, of course, if there's a priority, who's the priority? Morgan Grenfell. Now, there are all these Tory MPs now, a good lot of Labour ones as well, are bought in that way. This is just an example of the way there is no contest to it. Now, when I was at the Daily Mirror, I had a notice I put up. I wrote up this notice and put it up on the door of my office, just in case anyone had the wrong idea of where I stood. And it's a quotation, and I put it underneath, from good old Lenin. And this, I'll reread it. This is my favourite quotation. Of all my life, this is my favourite quotation. So I share it with you today. You know, you're very lucky to have this quotation shared with you. This is from the Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky. Short title. Bourgeois democracy, although a great historical advance in comparison to medievalism, always remains, and under capitalism is bound to remain, restricted, truncated, false and hypocritical. A paradise for the rich, and a snare and deception for the exploited, for the poor. Deceit, violence, corruption, mendacity, hypocrisy, and oppression of the poor is hidden beneath the civilized, polished and perfumed exterior of modern bourgeois democracy. That's it, absolutely, in a nutshell. It is it's two things, and we have to remember the first as well as the second. The famous quotation of Marx that men make their own history with not great please, you have to remember that first part as well as the second. It is an advance from medievalism. The very fact that we're here, we owe to the people who won from the ruling class the parliamentary democracy. Elections do matter. We do play parts in elections. We're glad sometimes to play parts in them. And what effect we can have if we go into those elections without the belief that those elections are the things that change society. I mean, the most wonderful story of the last 6 months for me, by miles, is the Isle of Dogs. I know that people were saying, well, the Nazis got a lot of votes, but what really was wonderful about the Isle of Dogs was the rise of the poll. The rise of the poll for years, 30% voted in municipal elections, and they voted a filthy, rotten, and tenacious and corrupt liberal administration for years and years and years. And then suddenly, all numbers of people who don't believe that you've changed society by voting anyway, go down and argue with people. We don't want these racists anywhere representing anybody in our society anywhere at all. And the result of it is not just that the racists are no longer represented, but the whole bloody stinking liberal administration is chucked out the window. So we remember these things and we take part, but it is a snare and a deception for the poor and the dispossessed. And the tactics of Tony Blair play into their hands. They're part of the snare and the delusion. They always claim down the real power that exists, the real reason why they're there, which is the class power. They're playing it down, taking away from it, making impotent the power that they actually have. Lenin's famous thing that a strike was more valuable than 1,000 parliamentary speeches or something of that kind, whatever the exact quotation, that is true. The strike, the single strike, is more effective in terms of changing people's minds and changing the balance in society in our direction than all those parliamentary speeches lumped into one. It's a different thing we're after. And what we're saying is that whoever the Labour Party leader, is my conclusion that you should vote for Prescott or what's her name, Beckett, I mean, they're the two of the most awful, they've got the most awful records, and I don't really want to go into it, how awful it is, because it just makes me sick to think of it. So that's not what I'm talking about at all. But I'm talking about telling, I'm saying, vote if you've got a vote, I suppose, if you want to. I was actually thanking heaven I haven't got a vote. I was thanking heaven I haven't got to choose between these three people. I was just thinking, well, awful about to Joe, anyway, we don't get into it, so horrible little thought of having to vote for one or other of these people. That's not the point. It really is not the point. The point is we must build. I play our part and constantly take part in all the things that go with parliamentary democracy, especially meetings and the like, but we need to build something separate to that on an entirely different basis. And the basis is so very, very simple, that the people who have the wealth at the top of society are not going to concede that wealth because somebody passes an act in Parliament. They're not going to. They're not going to give up their wealth and power until it is taken from them. And we need to build something quite separate to what Blair and Prescott and Beckett are building. Here old Rosa Luxemburg, best of them on this subject, 1900, I mean, we're coming up to the end of the century. 1900, she writes, social reform or revolution, when people said we can get power by parliamentary means. She could see it all those years ago. People who pronounced themselves in favour of the method of legislative reform in place of and in contradistinction to the conquest of political power and social revolution do not really choose a more tranquil, calmer and slower road to the same goal, but a different goal. Instead of taking a stand for the establishment of a new society, they take a stand for surface modifications of the old society. If we follow the political conceptions of revisionism, we arrive at the same conclusion that is reached when we follow the economic theories of revisionism. Our program becomes not the realization of socialism, but the reform of capitalism. Not the suppression of the system of wage labour, but the diminution of exploitation, that is, the suppression of the abuses of capitalism instead of the suppression of capitalism itself. We have to build on that basis for entirely new society. That's why we're all Nigel Flanagan.